welcome to the Disruptive Social Care Podcast with social care provocateur and social media queen Shirley Ayres and myself, Stuart Arnott, founder of Mindings, a service dedicated to bringing social media to the disconnected. In this weekly show, we aim to spread the word about what's going on in the world of disruptive social care, amplify the voices of people with great ideas that few people ever hear about, help our communities connect and collaborate, and interview thought leaders across the sector. Well, Shirley, show number 11.
And it's going so well. I'm so impressed by the amount of people who are now tuning in and listening and watching to the podcast.
And giving us questions to ask as well, which is great.
Absolutely.
So thanks for tweeting out in advance. Mark Brown is the director of Social Spider, a community interest company helping people make change happen. And he has three great interests: mental health, helping people communicate, and making projects work. Mark delivers Social Spider citizen journalism training, and he loves to use his own experiences of mental health difficulty as a way of helping others to talk and communicate about theirs. Mark tweets us at Mark1in4, and he's been described as one of the smartest thinkers in the world of social media, and hashtag mental health. And I certainly agree with that. Mark edits 1 in 4, England's only national mental health and wellbeing magazine written by people who experience mental health difficulties. Most people who contribute to 1 in 4 have direct experience of mental health difficulty themselves, and Mark was shortlisted for the Mind Champion Award 2010. So welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you.
So first of all, just to set the scene, give us a little bit of background about yourself and tell us how 1 in 4 came about.
A little bit of background about myself. In my sort of early 20s, I made an absolutely disastrous attempt to go to university. I was the world's worst student. I was at university for 2 years. I was actually there for about 2 months, over 2 years, because I was extremely ill with my mental health. After that, I had a period of unemployment that lasted for a couple of years. And it was sort of during that period of being unemployed and being unwell that I was sort of asking all these questions about what it means to have a mental health difficulty, and also, more importantly, how you actually go on to have a decent life while having a mental health difficulty. Because at the time I was sort of looking around, and there was quite a lot of sort of technical information about treatments, about services, and there was lots of really, really sort of awful and scary stories in tabloid newspapers and stuff like that. And so what I recognised then was that there was very, very little stuff that was actually written from the point of view of people with mental health difficulties about how you get on with life. And ultimately, sort of those experiences was the genesis of 1 in 4. So I found myself in the position of joining a company that had done sort of participatory media projects in the past, Social Spider, and we were having a breakfast at a Greasy Spoon Cafe, sort of knocking some ideas around. And I, like a fool, put my hand up and said, "Why don't we do a mental health magazine? It'll be awesome." And my colleague said, "Yes, let's do it." And that was ultimately the birth of 1 in 4. So we've been doing it for 4 years now, 4.25 years. So the project as a whole, I've been working on it for about 5 years. And hopefully we're getting somewhere with the magazine.
Absolutely. It's a great magazine. I had a good read of the one that you gave me the last time we met. What have been the biggest challenges that you've had in developing it?
Biggest challenges, I think, to a great extent, is sort of the idea of sort of breaking through this barrier around mental health and showing that people with mental health difficulties can actually be professionals as well as people with mental health difficulties. I think one of the barriers we've run into repeatedly is the idea that because something is delivered by people with mental health difficulties, it can't also be professional. So we set out, right from the start to sort of try and raise the bar around publications that were done by people with mental health difficulties. So we went for glossy, we went for properly designed. We also went for proper journalism because we thought it was really important to show that people with mental health difficulties can do stuff. But even now, 4 years on, I still have experiences where I'm sort of shunted into the position of service user when I'm talking to fellow professionals. It's something that I call, I coined a verb for it. It's something that I call to be beneficiaried, where someone has previously seen you as being a professional peer, someone on an equal standing, and then when you reveal, well, actually it came from my own experiences of mental health difficulty, you see a kind of strange cast come over their face, and their voice sort of changes tone, and you can see them sort of shifting you, almost physically, from that category of fellow professionals over here to the category of people we provide services for. So it's brilliant. I go into meetings sometimes with NHS trusts, and it's all going great until I say, well, it's written by people with mental health difficulties. And then it always ends up with them saying, well, you could come to our service users consultative committee and tell them all about it. And it's a really weird experience, because sometimes it's only when I reveal my own experience of mental health difficulties that happens. And I think that is a really big challenge for projects, services, companies that are done by people with mental health difficulties, because for a lot of professionals who are very well-meaning and have, very strong drive to help people with mental health difficulties, they still have a great problem that accepting that some of us might actually cross over to the other side of the desk. And I think the reason for that is it really, really challenges the basis on which you deliver services, because you stop talking about those people over there when some of those people over there are kind of your boss or the people you're commissioning services from. And that is one of the challenges. The other challenge has always been money. It's a difficult thing to fund a social enterprise project in general. It's a really difficult thing to fund a magazine project, because the problem we had with 1 in 4 was people not necessarily recognising its utility, that what we're doing is we're getting great information from the point of view of people with mental health difficulties out there to people who aren't necessarily in the loop of the rest of the debates about service user politics or the ins and outs of the health service. And I think it's been a challenge to get people to grasp that getting that information out there in a useful form is a different thing from your comms department topping and tailing an internal strategy document and then calling that something that the public can use to understand what a service does. That's another great challenge that we've had. But yeah, being skint is often a challenge.
So where does your revenue come from? I'm assuming it's bulk subscriptions?
Bulk subscriptions would be terrific. Initially, that was the model. We had the idea that this is fantastic. It's exactly what the NHS needs to do something slightly different from what it's already been doing. And we did get, in the first couple of years, we got some sizable bulk subscriptions from NHS trusts and local authorities. When the government changed in 2010 and we began to talk about austerity, those subscriptions dropped off very, very sharply, as you might imagine, because I think for larger organisations, what they're looking at is how much money are we expending? Can we use that to retain our existing level of staffing? So you cut off all of the extraneous stuff. So our revenue model is individual subscriptions, which is £10 for a year. You get 4 issues. It's really cheap.
It really is.
And some bulk subscriptions, and then we also cross-subsidise producing the magazine through the other mental health and social enterprise work that our company does. So yeah, we get through from issue to issue.
You were invited to Australia by the Richmond Fellowship of Western Australia to talk about new mental health, an exciting opportunity. What were the key messages and learnings from that?
It was really interesting for me going to Australia because I'd actually never left the country before. And being given the opportunity to leave the country for the first time and travelled to the opposite end of it for 24 hours was quite exciting. But what was really interesting about Australia is, one, Australia has an economy that's currently still expanding, not contracting. So it's quite interesting to go somewhere where the question of have we got enough money for mental health shouldn't really be an issue. Turned out to be just as much of an issue in Australia as here. So one thing I learned was no matter how much money is put into mental health, most people don't feel like it's enough, which suggests that mental health services might not be quite doing what people want, and arguments about cost is used as a way of maybe closing off debates about what mental health services could be. But the other really interesting thing about Australia was obviously Australia is like really big and people are really, really spread out, and that forces Australian mental health to think about what it does in a slightly different way to the way that we would think about mental health. Because you have the issue of Aboriginal Australians who have cultural rights and, to be honest, are a bit fed up with white Australians for very, very, very good reasons historically. There's a lot of issues around doing services in places that are particularly Aboriginal or just in small places. What you can't do in Australia is build a big mental health clinic and then expect people to travel for 4, 5, 6 hours across the entire territory to get to it. So they tend to look more at taking mental health out of its sort of organised, it's great big, what would you call it? It's sort of great big organisational box, this institutional box, and looking at how you put mental health into existing communities and existing things. So, for instance, what you would do in Australia, if you're looking to do something for Aboriginal people's mental health, you wouldn't set up a specific project and then hope that Aboriginal people would come to it. What you would look at doing is training someone or inserting someone into an existing organisation, a community centre, a cultural centre or whatever, with the mental health training skills or ideas to make the mental health impacts happen. And I think that was really, really interesting for me, because that's to an extent what I've been arguing for in the UK, that what we need to do is get mental health out of its big mental health box and take mental health into all of the other areas of social care, and to an extent all of the other areas of everything, if you like. But it's a completely different paradigm. So instead of building a big thing and saying to people, well, people don't really understand mental health and they don't understand what they need from mental health, that's why they don't come to our great big clinic that only happens once a week and you have to make an appointment 6 weeks in advance. It would be taking people with mental health understanding, mental health skills, mental health learning, and actually getting them into housing teams, getting them into GP surgeries, getting them into all of the elements of, if you like, state provision in the UK. They already do that in Australia. And I think that's really, really interesting for me, because it presents a sort of different way of thinking about how we reach people with support for mental health.
So my question was therefore going to be, what have you brought back, and is there some of that learnings that we can apply over here? Because I'm thinking myself, come from Scotland, we have lots of remote communities, particularly in the islands, where it's not as remote as Australia, but clearly, these issues of remoteness must be a factor.
Well, I think part of the really important thing to think about is what people need for their mental health is not always traditional services, nor is it traditional treatment. Treatment's extremely important, but treatment tends to deal with people's symptoms, and it has a sort of notion that if you remove someone's symptoms, then their life will be okay. It's not really how it works. I think what we could look at more is what we can do to help people with mental health difficulties have a decent life. And I think that's a very, very different question from how do we provide services that alleviate symptoms. That's always going to be very, very important. But as far as a lot of more traditional thinking about mental health stands, the person's life basically ends at the point they leave your consulting room, which is not how people experience their lives. 1 hour a month being involved with mental health services leaves the rest of the time you're awake and asleep that you're dealing with mental health difficulties. So I think in terms of Scotland and sort of any rural areas, and potentially I think urban areas as well, we have to look at what people with mental health difficulties need and want. And very often people say, well, what I want is treatment, because that's the way we've been sort of conditioned into thinking about mental health, that ultimately if we as people with mental health difficulties could somehow find that magic pill that would remove our symptoms, everything in our life would be all right. And that's not really what life's like, because what we can do is we can do lots of things to help us offset the effect of our mental health difficulty in the way that people with physical disabilities adapt their lives around their disability so that they're not disabled by it. So we look more at what are the things that help people stay well, rather than looking at what are the things that will cure people, because that's a kind of holy grail. And it would be brilliant if tomorrow someone said, actually, what I've discovered is if you eat 15 lemons and then run backwards around the graveyard 6 times, it will cure your schizophrenia. But the likelihood of that is quite slim. So the question for me, and I think the question we should be asking, is what can we do, what can we support to happen, what can we make happen ourselves that will make life for people with mental health difficulties easier, less distressing, more exciting and more livable? And the answer for me in that is not in a big institution. The answer for that is in communities. And I think that's the key we need to turn, because community mental health is kind of seen as a bit of a weird uncle to proper mental health services and evidence-based practice and all of that. And at the minute, there's a kind of stranglehold, I think, in funding around mental health. As the sort of as austerity continues, what we're seeing is more and more a retreat behind the front lines. It's like we've got to have, these really, really important services, and they're more important, and everything else is kind of a bit of a frippery that we tried when things were better, when we were younger and we had more expensive trousers and we could muck about more. Now we're back to the real service provision. And I think that's really, really dangerous. And I think it's a massive danger for the next 10 years, that what we'll do is we'll actually fail to build on lots of the interesting stuff that's happened in mental health around people with mental health difficulties doing things for themselves, in terms of developing our own projects, developing peer support. And also what I think, is the next frontier is taking that mental health out of its box into other organisations. And I think for a lot of larger mental health organisations at the minute, that's a very, very scary proposition, because basically I think the logic suggests that the big instrumental ways of doing mental health haven't been the correct ones. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because the government has a very big focus on developing community social capital. And
Absolutely.
in a sense, what you're saying is totally in line with the need to develop resilience in communities.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, actually. Myself and David, my colleague, spent a big chunk of 2011 writing a document called Better Mental Health in a Bigger Society. It was commissioned in the dying days of the National Mental Health Development Unit. It was funded by the NHS Confederation, finally published by the Mental Health Providers Forum. And what we did was we looked at that emerging idea of big society and sort of thought about, well, what does this mean for people with mental health difficulties? And what we recognised was some of those ideas about community resilience, getting people together, helping people to take forward their own projects, recognising their own needs and the needs of people around them, which was the big dream of the big society stuff, actually crossed over incredibly well with a lot of the more radical elements that had come out of mental health thinking, peer support, co-production, stuff like building social capital. Yep. And we were, to an extent, trying to influence the discussion away from the boo, we hate the big society, it means we'll have no public services, and direct it in what we hoped would be a more useful direction. Don't think we quite succeeded in that, because to an extent I think the current government has bottled it in terms of thinking about sort of devolving powers to communities, supporting communities, because I think there were some elements that got that and some that didn't. Yeah. And I think that's a very big sadness. So what we have is, in theory, lots of legal powers that would enable local communities to take forward, things forward. But what we don't have is any funding or any real support for doing that. And we definitely don't have that in mental health, which I think is a massive, massive shame. So what you've got is one sort of policy drift going in one direction, while the more hard-headed policy drift is going in the other direction. So, I mean, looking at PIP and universal credit, the what will replace all of the benefits, it's going to be very, very, or they're floating very, very draconian rules about volunteering. Yeah. And volunteering and social capital generation go together really well. So you've got some people saying we're trying to develop communities, and then you've got some other people saying, you know what, we do want to develop communities, but we don't want those people to develop communities. We want those to do something else. And I think that's really difficult. But I do feel that in mental health there hasn't been quite as much of a strong voice for this sort of new mental health, this people with mental health difficulties doing things for themselves, because it kind of conflicts with established organisations and their wish to continue to receive funding and deliver services, which is based on a model that I think, to an extent, has had its day. That the whole idea that what you need to do is you need to provide a day centre for people with mental health difficulties, rather than some bits of seed funding for people with mental health difficulties to set up a whole range of activities during a day that they themselves want to do. I think that's the model that should be having its time now, but the question of money is really the pressing one.
Well, if you're thinking about innovation, and we talk about, we mentioned casserole most weeks, it's one of our favourite ones, but, if I have a person who's having some issues, then perhaps instead of some more lithium, what they would rather have is a service like casserole that would deliver them a hot meal and a bit of company for a while.
Well, absolutely. That's the thing, isn't it? If you shift away from the medical model that says that the answer is to reduce someone's symptoms, then it opens up an entire new frontier of thinking about what people actually want or need. Because one of the things I always say is traditional mental health services are fantastic at providing you treatment. That's what the NHS is really good at. And to an extent that maybe is what the NHS should focus on. But a traditional mental health service isn't really officially able to find you a boyfriend or girlfriend or a mate to play Scrabble with. It can't do those things. And, to an extent, I think it shouldn't try to. But there is all of this stuff that can happen where you have people coming together to do things on a more informal basis, which is, is social capital generation. And stuff like casserole is really, really interesting.
And that informality helps, because as I often say, that sometimes the problem is if you start to get local authorities involved, they're going to want to inspect the kitchens and CRB check all the staff. But if it's done at that informal community level, then it can be scaled up in that way.
But the question that will always come up is risk, which is if we fund something like casserole for people with mental health difficulties, how do we know that the people with mental health difficulties won't be exploited? Or how can we take responsibility for it that the people providing that extra portion of food won't be evil? And then, because if something goes wrong, then the Daily Mail will be knocking on our door saying, we funded this evil project that left this person without support. There's this really big aversion to risk, which is, I think, is strangling innovation in mental health. I absolutely do think it's strangling innovation in mental health. When I was down in Australia, Rachel Perkins was down there as well, and she was speaking. And one of the really interesting things that she said in her presentation, it's a point I've heard her make a lot of times, is in mental health we have to think about risk. It's very important to make sure people are okay, but we also have to think about the risk that we bring into the situation of preventing things happening in people's lives. Because we can look to keep people safe, but we have to look at whether keeping people safe actually prevents people from taking the risks they need for something new and brilliant to happen. So it's her contention that mental health services traditionally have focused very much on keeping people safe, but that has meant they've remained as service users for large portions of their life. And I've had that, I suppose it's an experience I have myself, and it's an experience a lot of other people with mental health difficulties have had, which is the notion of them having a mental health difficulty being used as an argument against them going forward with something they want to do. Oh, are you sure you'll be able to do it? Are you sure something bad won't happen? We can't take responsibility for it if you want to go out clubbing all night, etc., etc. That notion of preventing risk, introducing a new risk of good things not happening, I think is a really fundamental question when we're thinking about mental health innovation.
It's also, of course, that with something like mental health, it's difficult because when you bring in, a health service brings in an intervention, they need to see an index that has been raised because of their intervention. It's got to be scored. It's got to be something that. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I think there's, I think it's a really good argument to be made that what we need is little solutions, small solutions, rather than large solutions. Because if you introduce a large solution, a costly intervention that involves setting up an entire new service, employing lots of staff, getting premises, that means that you have to have quite a high level of success in delivering it. Basically, you can't take risks delivering it. If you spend £1 million developing a new service and what you get is 20 clients, that means you spent quite a lot per head on each intervention. If we look at ways of doing less expensive innovations, which will be more risky and more interesting potentially, and sort of spreading out the risk of that. So instead of saying, well, our trust has some money to develop some new things around mental health, what we're going to do is we're going to give £750,000 to one organisation. How about giving £10,000 as a bit of seed money to 100 different projects in your area. Just imagine that. If you had a hit rate of 10% of that, you wouldn't have wasted any money. And I think that thinking about that, about sort of financial risk, putting all your eggs in one basket.
It's a discussion we have a lot, actually. It's the very same
yes.
thing about myself as an entrepreneur, getting money, is that, and I'll mention it again because it's one of my favourite things. It was a technology strategy board event that Guy Kawasaki was at. And he was a little bit cross because they were putting, TSB were putting £1 million on the table, 10 times 100,000. And he said, why don't you give 50 times 20,000?
Yeah.
Fund lots of things, and it's that kind of disruptive innovation that a lot of companies are now trying to encourage by not coming at a problem with one big organisation, but by splitting people. The pharmaceutical industry is a good example of that now. I know that some of the big pharmas, they build these huge hubs where they want to make big blockbuster drugs, and now what they're doing is splitting them into small teams that are almost quite competitive, and they're finding that's a much better way to work.
Yeah, I think we have a challenge for that model in mental health, because in mental health, I think it's about 87% of the money in mental health that's spent overall in mental health in the country is spent within the NHS. It goes to the NHS. 67% of that is kept within the NHS. Looking at the last statistics that we looked at, so most of the money is going into the NHS, and this creates a weird effect in that if we're talking about investment in mental health, it's very, very difficult to assess what the return on an investment might be, because basically you're led to a small group of people, NHS commissioners, as the only potential market, is the way people will look at it. It's like, well, if we're going to invest in you, we want a return on our investment. What do NHS commissioners want? And at the moment we have the problem that very few NHS commissioners are thinking strategically about developing things in their area that might be useful, because it's not really their job. They're not really paid to innovate. Some will, and some do, and it's fantastic when that happens. But it's not really the job of an NHS commissioner to think strategically about what people with mental health difficulties need. It's their job to look at what does the NHS recognise as the things we have to fulfil for people with mental health difficulties, and how can we do that in the safest, most cost-effective and least risky way. And they're the people who basically have the majority of the money, and that's a really big challenge, because it's the problem we have at looking just in the question of how you fund innovation in mental health. There's very few places to go to, and quite reasonably, if you go to a straight financial investor, they'll go, well, sounds like a lovely idea, but can you tell me what you think the profits will be in the first year? And you end up saying, well, to be honest, unless we can get some people with mental health difficulties, whom we know very often, unfortunately, due to the effect that having a mental health difficulty has on your life, your employment prospects, etc., often don't have that much money. We can't really charge very much for the product, so we're not going to make very much profit. And an investor will say, well, sounds really lovely, but in your business plan, it says, I give you some money, and then you don't give it back to me.
When I want 7 to 10 times my initial investment back.
Yeah, or even 2 to 3, or even just the investment back.
Yeah.
And I think that is a real challenge, and it's something that we're beginning to explore, looking at where's the money in mental health, where are the potential markets. I think one thing that's interesting is that no one knows what the value of self-funding in mental health is, because no one's ever thought to look at it, because people with mental health difficulties, as far as people are concerned, are skint and never look for services for themselves. They go to the NHS, so no one actually knows what the value of the self-funding market in mental health is. We know that for physical disabilities, because physical disabilities doesn't have the same ingrained notion that the only people that can answer the needs of people with disabilities is traditional services. In mental health, we still have the notion that the only people who can answer the needs of people with mental health difficulties are psychologists and clinical psychologists. Psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, community psychiatric nurses, and mental health teams, which is a bit weird when you think about it. And I think it's because mental health hasn't quite got to the point that the broader disability movement has got to. I don't think mental health has got to that point of a social model of mental health difficulty which is really interesting. I think there's lots of, we'll probably talk about this another time, but there's lots and lots of reasons why that hasn't happened.
And of course, with physical disability, there's lots of bits of physical kit that you can throw at the problem. But lots of innovation there. So we had a question from Ermintry 2, and that was about working with new ideas in old systems and how to change commissioning. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's, in some respects, that's the fundamental question. We have lots of stuff that exists, and the question is, how do we modify that stuff to get it to do things that are better? But I think it's really difficult. I was thinking about this quite a lot last night, about how you change commission and commissioning, and you change services. And I think there's something that happens in mental health that happens across a lot of elements of public service provision, where the purpose of doing a particular series of actions gets overtaken by the practice of doing a series of particular actions. So in the context of, say, personalisation in mental health, it's being handed down as a very instrumental tick box process, which is a bit weird, because actually personalisation would require a kind of relationship-based. You know, I'm talking to you, you're talking to me, I'm kind of getting a handle about what you might want. Here's where I can help you to get it. And it's become, it's being handed down as a transactional thing. I've got to do some personalisation with you. Here's what personalisation is. I've got about 35 minutes to do it with you. And I think looking at where things should be sort of relationship-based and where things are usefully transactional is probably one of the most important things to do, because there's loads of stuff. It's really weird in mental health. Mental health is probably the only, or one of the few elements of human endeavour that's completely about an individual. It's about what's going on in someone's head and what's going on in their life. But very, very strangely, lots and lots of elements of what we do around mental health is basically transactional. It's filling in a form, it's fulfilling a particular criteria, it's a checklist, it's a set of criteria, etc., etc. So there's big chunks of what, because a lot of the time I think when people look for mental health support, they're as much looking for understanding, companionship and help with their life as they are with filling in a form or fitting a series of criteria, etc., etc. Because people are kind of higgledy-piggledy and don't really fit very well into very, very structured boxes. But we provide mental health, weirdly, in something that is very much about divisions, boundaries, the way services do or don't interlock with each other. One of the things that would be interesting is actually to look at how and where systems do and don't work. I think there's a really, in mental health, people talk about non-compliance. Oh, such and such is a non-compliant patient. Oh, those people, they always miss their appointments, etc., etc. And it's always struck me that very often people, whether they know it consciously or not, are basically voting with their feet. They're saying, this service is not doing what I need it to do at this point. Therefore, I'm disengaging from it. Now, if you think about that, if you ran a hotel and, a huge, a percentage of your customers basically disengage from your hotel process, they come to stay, they saw the reception of the hotel, they said, oh, sod this isn't for me, I'm off. You would think that there was a problem with the hotel. Your business model didn't work, you were doing something wrong. In mental health, we say it's the problem of the patient or the person with mental health difficulties. They haven't managed to fit themselves to, we all know the system's terrible and we all know it doesn't work, but really what we need you to do is really go that extra mile to fit yourself to it. It's a really, really strange idea. And it wouldn't work in any other area of human endeavour.
Yeah, I was just going to add the observation about silo thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is the Disruptive Social Care podcast, of course. How do you think that disruptive technology can impact on mental health services?
Well, I think the question about how it can impact on mental health services isn't the same as the question of how it can impact on the lives of people with mental health difficulties. I've been to enough things about technology and mental health to know that most people think about technology as being a way that we could do mental health services better. If we were to do technology really well, then maybe people would need mental health services less, or would be looking for very specific things from mental health services that were different from taking a whole lifetime of problems and difficult situations and trying to find some way to sort those out from a system that can't do that. I was talking to someone last night about this, about the sort of potential for technology to basically modify and adapt for things that people with mental health difficulties experience. And one of the examples that I was thinking of is, I've talked to enough people with schizophrenia to know that very often people with schizophrenia will say, one of the problems I have when it comes to sitting down and writing, so going into academia or whatever, is it's really difficult to structure my thoughts. I know I have schizophrenia, and the reason why that makes it difficult is because instead of being able to start from an initial hypothesis and move logically through to a conclusion, what I find myself doing is, instead of starting on one point and then each point following logically, what I end up doing is chaining thoughts. So the last line of my first paragraph becomes the first line of my second paragraph, and it takes me off course. What I was thinking, just an example of something that would be really disruptive, is this, you have screenwriting software that helps you structure a screenplay.
Yeah.
Why couldn't someone go away and develop some writing or thinking software that would help people with schizophrenia organise their thoughts, which would make it much easier for them to take part in things like academia, to work professionally in white-collar jobs and stuff like that. Basically adapting the world a bit to suit them better in the way they are. And what's interesting, every time I use this example with people always get this kind of weird feeling in their gorge saying, well, hang on, wouldn't that be cheating? Wouldn't that be like, isn't that just making it so that those people don't try to get better? And I go, yeah, that's exactly the point. The reason why you're finding it very weird is it's because it's applying the kinds of thinking that have been very, very useful in disability to mental health. And we have a weird myth in mental health that all of us who experience a mental health difficulty will get better someday. One day we'll wake up and we won't have our condition. I think that's one of the things that's been holding back innovation, because we haven't really focused on what you can do in real time to provide adaptations and support around what people with mental health difficulties actually want to do.
So that would be something like the Microsoft Paperclip, but a little bit more advanced than that.
Yeah, it could be. I mean,
it looks like you're writing a letter. Let me help you with the formatting of that.
Yeah, so if you start thinking about it like that, recognising the difficulties and the challenges that people have, then technology can follow from that. I think a lot of the time when people are talking about technology and mental health, digital technology and mental health, they're basically talking about telehealth, which is a new way of providing an existing service on the kind of models we've already had. I think there's a whole world of really exciting stuff happening around sort of augmenting reality or augmenting experience or augmenting thinking in sort of technology that would be really, really interesting to explore in mental health. But I don't think that's the direction most people are going. I think there's some really good examples of applications that do things, mood scale stuff, buddy, things like that. But when you look at them, they're basically a very, very simple idea, and they aren't necessarily what people with mental health difficulties would choose to help them get through a day. I mean, for instance, example, I'm always thinking about stupid, ridiculous ideas like this. And one of the ones that I came up with was I sometimes have panic attacks when travelling. I was thinking, wouldn't it be really good if I had an application on my phone that was just like a big red button? And when I pressed it, all it did was it was synced with my Google Calendar, and it sent a very polite note to the people I was trying to meet in the next hour saying, I had a panic attack. I'll probably be about half an hour late. Really sorry. Thus removing part of the panic of the sort of spiral of I'm going to be late, I've got to rush, etc., etc. Now, some people would say, well, isn't that just letting you off the hook of getting better from having anxiety? And my argument would be, no, that's a bit like saying, isn't having ramps letting people with limited mobility off the hook of finding ways of dragging themselves up the stairs? So I think that's kind of the way that I think about it. But I think it's been underexplored in mental health because mental health has all these countervailing forces about cure and then the holy grail. And also that there's a weird sort of, sometimes coded into mental health services is that even though people don't intend it, there's still that moral notion that somehow people with mental health difficulties are a bit to blame for their difficulties. Even though people don't say it, it's still kind of coded into very often notions of treatment. You're not trying hard enough to get better, you need to invest in the process, etc., which has headed off the notion of making adaptations now. And it's weird because it should be really easy to adapt workplaces for people with mental health difficulties. But it's amazing the amount of resistance there is to the suggestions that people make about the things that make their job more difficult, that interact with their mental health and how they might be changed. Because there is that notion of, well, you're getting special treatment. No one else is allowed to get up for a break at this call centre, and you're saying you need to go for a break every 20 minutes. You skiver.
I'm interested in loneliness. That's one of the things that drives me to develop Mindings. The campaign to end loneliness said at the launch of the toolkit in July that loneliness has a similar impact on mortality as smoking. Worse for us than obesity, and increases the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by 50%. That's extraordinary. But a friend recently told me that he'd rather admit to being depressed than being lonely. How is loneliness considered within the umbrella of mental health, and how can digital inclusion and social media contribute?
Well, the loneliness thing is really, really interesting. It goes back to that thing about moral failing. We tend to see being lonely as a complete failure of being a useful adult in our exciting, goal-getting 21st century world. In fact, it's very, very easy. When you get to be, an adult beyond the age of compulsory school age, actually, very often you're not often involved in many shared activities with other people, apart from work. If you haven't got a job, where you're going to go to meet people on a day-to-day basis, sort of friendship or kinship comes from regular exposure and something vaguely shared or in common. So if you look at it, we have loads of notions that say being lonely is bad because it basically means that you failed. So you can see there's a big stigma over loneliness in general. I think people with mental health difficulties often feel very lonely because if you are in the point where your major contact with other people is the use of services don't generate social capital. They don't give you an opportunity to meet people. This is why I would argue that it's really important we look at supporting the development of things that happen in communities because, your psychiatrist isn't going to be a best mate, but the person who runs, a local benefits advice drop-in might turn out to be the person that don't know what people do when they're friends anymore as grown-ups. Do they have barbecues? Discuss conservatories? I don't know what people do anymore. But I do think the more we develop sort of community-based things, the more opportunity people have to come in contact with each other. And that's a really important thing about loneliness. But I think that there's different... I wrote an article about this a while ago. There's different forms of loneliness, and it's worthwhile breaking down loneliness into its different forms. There's what you might call classic loneliness, which is someone literally not seeing anyone, and that has a weird sort of physical effect that basically the less people you see, the less signals you make in terms of non-verbal signals about wanting to speak to people. So there's a kind of vicious circle or vicious spiral. But the other form of loneliness I think is much more interesting, which is not having your needs met by people around you. Literally not finding anyone in your immediate circle that really fulfills some emotional or intellectual needs that you have. And I think that's just as difficult and pernicious. It's the classic thing is the person who's married but is still lonely. Doesn't mean they love their partner any less. It's just that their partner cannot fulfill all things that they need out of emotional relationships. And I think online's really interesting because online stuff allows us to form kind of communities of affinity or elective communities. And people say, oh, well, this is why online's bad. It's just loads of people who think the same thing hanging around with each other. It's like, Twitter's like a braying electronic left-wing mob because it's just loads of people who are left-wing who group together and don't listen to anyone else's arguments. But if you think about it in terms of, I always think about sort of discussions about social capital and community. My test case is always, people always use examples of say, oh, well, it was great in the old days when everyone lived in villages, pit villages, and everyone knew each other and they had really strong social bonds. I say, yeah, but imagine you were growing up in the Welsh Valleys in the 1950s and you were gay. You might have all the things that people would recognise as the determinants of social capital and the stuff that would end loneliness, but unless you knew another gay person, there'd be big portions of you that you would feel lonely about. And I think what's happened with the internet is really, really interesting in that people have been able, regardless of where they are physically, to find people that they have affinity with. And that's that sort of second form of loneliness. That's not that is the alone in the crowd loneliness. And that's the really interesting thing about being able to meet people online. And people always say, oh, well, it's just getting friends on Facebook. That's not the same as real friendship. But I think the majority of people that I know, and it's been my own experience as well, is that often the links of affinity that you make online actually carry themselves offline. And it's really weird. I think there's basically two kinds of people in the world. There's people who go, isn't a tweet up really weird? Why would a load of strangers get together? And then the other group of people is the people who've done it, who've just actually said, you know what, we've been getting on really well. Why don't we meet in real life? And I think if you actually collected case studies around this, you find that so many people actually have found their friendship group, their kinship group, through online now, if they're online. I think it's a really, really interesting thing. And I don't think it's necessarily a generational difference. It's a, do you engage with social media or don't you question?
Mark, it's been great having you. Thank you very much for coming along today. We have a tradition where we do some Follow Fridays. So do you have some Follow Fridays that you would like to recommend? Some people.
I do have some Follow Fridays. I was thinking about this. My first Follow Friday is Dawn Willis, whose Twitter name I can never pronounce. It's Quinonostante.
We'll caption it, don't worry.
That's probably a good thing.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Dawn just does a really good job of keeping everyone abreast of what's happening in mental health across the UK. She does it off her own back. No one pays her for it. Does a fantastic job of it. The second Follow Friday is Dr. Jonathan Tomlinson, the famous tweeting GP, whose Twitter name is Mellow Johnny. He is doing an amazing job of being a public professional in terms of discussing the issues around being a GP. He blogs, he tweets in a public place, and it's absolutely fascinating to read his thinking. My third Follow Friday is a slightly self-serving one. I think you should follow my co-director at Social Spider, David Floyd, who's David at Social Spider, because he's fantastic at analysing what's happening in social enterprise. And he's been doing some really good stuff recently about how the current wave of social investment might not manage to either invest or be social. Really worth reading.
Absolutely great for that. Well, we'll put all the usual links in our show notes, our extensive show notes that we put out. I've really enjoyed that chat, actually.
I think it's been fascinating, and I think there's going to be a much bigger debate about new mental health. So thank you, Mark, for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And do follow our website, disruptivesocialcare.com. Come and join us on Facebook, facebook.com/disruptivesocialcare. And of course, you can follow me at Minding Stew.
And me at Shirley Ayres.
And me at Mark1in4 if you would like to hear more of my exciting nonsense on a regular Twitter basis.
See you soon.
Bye.